Hello, everybody at Blogging Heads. I'm back this week, and I have a great guest today who is a professor of sociology at Cal State Long Beach, also the proprietor of probably my favorite MP3 blog, which is called Soul Sides, and also a contributing music critic to NPR who has written for LA Times and a number of publications. Everybody, I give you Oliver Wang. How are you today, Oliver?
Really good. Thanks for having me.
No, thanks for doing this. We've been trying to do this for quite a few months now. So let me sort of start off, and I want, first of all, just for the listener, and we'll have a link on the side, describe what Soul Sides and Poplix in your blog empire. What is Soul Sides all about?
Well, I started Soul Sides not that long after I stopped doing college radio, and it wasn't really a conscious choice to stop doing terrestrial radio and move into audio blogging instead. But I do think the timing of it was probably, in hindsight, not coincidental. I think I still wanted to have some kind of outlet to be able to play music, to talk about music, and blogging also gave me the component to it was a space to sort of also work on my music writing in a more informal space. But you know, the gist of it is Soul Sides it's an audio blog that's dedicated to the myriad styles of soul music. So that includes formal R&B, but it also includes everything that draws from or has some kind of interaction with soul music. So hip hop, Latin music, obviously funk, music styles from around the world that have had some kind of encounter or integration of soul at some point.
I love the blog, and it's actually in a weird way because I'm a longtime record collector, and I actually began following Oliver before you had Soul Sides because I would read your reviews of records to find out, because I trusted your criticism, to find out what was worth buying when I would go to flea markets and stuff. And then, with the advent of MP3 technology, I was able to listen to it over the internet, and then, obviously we all end up getting iPods and hard drives and so forth, and that changes the way we consume music. Here's a question, though, for you, which is that, I have bought far, far fewer records in the last 3 or 4 years than I did, obviously, before. And with folks like yourself, and I could name a few other MP3 blogs that I really like. I guess one is Mixtape Riot, that's really great. Is this in some ways killing the old kind of geeky guild of record collectors?
So, I'm sorry, repeat that last part again? Is
the MP3 blog killing the record collector?
Oh God, I don't think so at all. I mean,
okay, so defend record collecting in the era of the MP3 blog.
I'll say this much: there might be, a group of people who, in a previous generation, might have turned to record collecting or CD collecting as a way to have access to the music. But I think for a lot of record collectors, it's really not just about the music. I mean, obviously that has a big part of it, but it's also about the object. We like the tangibility, the tactileness of holding the record in our hand, to be able to look at the artwork. And it's about possession as well. I mean, I know people who more or less collect MP3s, and so for them, their idea of collecting is accumulating as many MP3s from different sources as possible, and instead of a record case, they have a terabyte drive. But the impulse around collecting is not so much, I think, focused on mediums as it is just what it is that you're trying to consume. So, for MP3 collectors, it's about having this massive music library at their disposal. I think for record collectors, it's about having the records themselves. And I've talked with a few people who run record stores, and even though certainly the growth in digital music and especially digital DJing has changed the market, a lot of people are basically unloading collections because they're going purely digital, which is creating new opportunities for other record collectors to basically profit from, not the disappearance, but the sale of those collections. So. I think things have shifted. It's not as if record collecting in 2009 looks the same way it did 10 years ago, but I don't think that it's actually harmed that particular. It hasn't harmed record collecting at all, because for most hardcore record collectors, it's really about the record, and you can't duplicate that in ones and zeros.
Well, I would sort of build off that point, which is that the reason that I got into collecting records as opposed to buying CDs is because I was finding that you could get fantastic music on vinyl and in many cases cheaper if you weren't, concerned about a pristine condition. But because of the internet, it actually in some ways opens up a lot of music as well. And, I've gotten older and I have less time, I think, to kind of go to flea markets and do the work. It takes like a whole day, I think, to really have a good day of crate digging. But, in a way, I feel like it's, my friend Michael Crowley wrote a piece several years ago about how iPods were ruining the art of collecting music. Like, it actually takes a lot of time to find great obscure music. And now it's so available to so many people on the internet that they don't appreciate the kind of work that went into trying to get these things. And it's just there's an expectation that they can have these things, and maybe a lot of people don't appreciate it as much. What do you think about that?
I've heard of that argument before. I think that there's something to that, but if the difference is I have this rare record that now anyone who has access to the internet can find a rip of because someone in Sweden burned it and put it up and then it got borrowed or duped by another site, you're sort of arguing over like who gets props for what. And believe me, I know part of collecting is having sort of something that's so unique that no one else has it. But just because a record exists in an MP3 form where it's easily transferable, that doesn't mean the record itself is any more common. It's just that the knowledge around the record is more common. And I can understand how some people might be a little bit peeved at that, but in the end, if you have something that most other people don't have, I would think that you could still take pleasure in having possession of that if that's what it's about. If you're really that caught up with the uniqueness of something to the point where it's really about controlling knowledge, I understand that that's not my interest in collecting. I'm not interested in holding on to stuff that no one else knows about.
Right.
I wouldn't be blogging if that was the case. And I think, the other side of it is that the expansion and the awareness of what's out there, I think, has changed incredibly because of the internet. That I'm now able to learn about records in other countries, especially. I collect a lot of Latin music, so my ability to know about stuff that's in Colombia and Peru and Venezuela and Panama. I think that's largely been abetted by just access to stuff that gets up on the internet. So I wouldn't even know about these things if not for that. So it's sort of this double-edged sword. You kind of have to take both sides of it. You can't just sort of benefit from one and not have to deal with the repercussions on the other side.
Okay, well, I want to kind of continue a little bit on Soul Sides, and I want to get more into the particulars. You have done a lot of these CDs, and they're really. We'll have a link up. I recommend getting the Deep Covers volumes, and you've done a lot of these mixtapes. Can you talk a little bit about some of your favorite songs that you've shared and what they mean to you? I hope I'm not off-putting you here, and I know that that's a very open-ended question. Maybe we could start with Latin. You've done incredible work of really kind of sharing the catalog of Joe Bataan, who I knew about before you started posting it, but I didn't really fully appreciate until I kind of got into a lot of these songs. So I don't know, if you just sort of talk about some of your favorite stuff that you've kind of put out there, or themes or something like that.
Well, it's always sort of tough to know where to start because my favorites is a very long list, but also
of course,
constantly evolving. But you brought up Joe Bataan, and for those who are unfamiliar, Joe Bataan is a soul singer, Latin soul singer, who got his start in the mid-1960s as part of the Boogaloo movement, and then transitioned into Latin soul. And then salsa music in the 1970s, and was very successful with that. To me, my interest in artists is always a combination between what their output is. So obviously the music has to reach me on some level, but the artists that I really, really attach to are the ones who I think have these great backstories. In the case of Khan, this is a guy who had a Filipino-American father and an African-American mother. Grew up in East Harlem, passing as Puerto Rican, used to lead a Puerto Rican gang up by 103rd Street, and then came out of jail in his early 20s and decided that he wanted to become a musician. And it's sort of one of those very storybook, narratives about someone turning their life around and saving their life through music. But this is what Joe really I mean, he lived it. This is what he really believes. And he has had such an incredibly diverse career, going from boogaloo to Latin soul to South soul. And then he put out a very early hip-hop record in 1979. So he was really kind of...
No way.
Yeah, I mean, he was really...
You haven't shared that yet, I've noticed. You haven't... I haven't seen a link to the Joe Bataan. I didn't know Joe Bataan did a hip-hop record.
You know, it actually was a pretty decent hit in Europe. And I actually saw... What's crazy is that... I mean, the thing about Joe is, I mean, he was of a, older generation than I think a lot of the kind of old-school rap heads that were coming out. And so he had a sense of what was going on musically. I don't know if he necessarily had quite the same fashion sense that you might have seen, in the South Bronx at the time. So on his single is called Rapo Clapo, and he's wearing this crazy, like, rainbow-colored T-shirt and pants with suspenders. I'm not going to say that suspenders are not hip-hop, but you don't see...
They're not hip-hop.
Suspenders in hip-hop.
That's Mork and Mindy.
But his single was such a hit that I just saw someone had posted this European rap artist from the same time, this white kid, basically had copied the album cover, including the suspenders and the T-shirt. And I was just sort of bugging out at the fact that someone would cop that style off of Joe Bataan's sort of like. And I've always wanted to ask him, like, where did it come up? Where did you come up with the idea to rock rainbow suspenders?
Well, I'm a huge Joe Bataan fan, in large part because of your work on it. And by the way, the blog is not just links. I'm a big fan of Oliver's writing. Your writing, Oliver. So I want to say that you get a lot of backstory. He's a good journalist, a very good journalist, and good writer and critic. So when you kind of go into Soul Sides, you're getting a lot more than just the audio file. It's a lot of the backstory. It's an addictive blog, I have to say.
They just want the music. I could post that. No. Anyways, I'm Josh. Go.
Okay. No. Okay. So, but here's the thing. I would say that Joe Bataan's Sal Soul part of his catalog is what you would expect to hear in the disco in the movie Carlito's Way, and it's very different than almost this kind of gritty, very harmony-intensive soul music that you get from his sort of early 70s, late 60s. And it's very rare, I think, to see an artist make this kind of transition, and Bataan is one of them. Maybe you could talk about other artists who have sort of really successfully evolved with the times, and in this really rich period. I mean, I have to say that as somebody who was in the crate digger community, and still is, really the golden years are probably 67 to maybe 74. And almost everything from that period is fantastic. But there you can see sort of the evolution. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Wait, what do you mean? Which golden period are you talking about? Of what?
Well, I'm saying that there tends to be, and this is an oversimplification, but I think there tends to be a sort of understanding that about 67, 68 to about 73, 74, you can't go wrong. A lot of obviously people sometimes collect on the label. Some people, certainly the artist. But that's such a rich period, and, a lot of music from that period, unless you're, in Lawrence Welk zone, is going to have at least one or two good tracks on it.
I mean, I've heard that argument before, but it doesn't hold a lot of water, because you can go to 75 and 76 and 77, and you can still find great music being made.
Oh, of course.
65 and 64. So, I mean, I think that idea developed really out of, if I recall, it really was this idea that funk music's best years were, between 68 and 74. I think it's something that maybe even DJ Shadow had said, 10 plus years ago that
right.
Glommed onto. I don't think that many. I mean, I think if you really listen to music from before and after that era, you wouldn't make the argument that only that it was either guaranteed to be good in that time, or
right.
music preceding or following it was somewhat worse. I think if you're into a particular kind of sound, then sure, that makes more sense, because those 5-6 years are when that style of sound dominated. But to me, it's sort of similar, like saying that the only good hip hop that was made was between 86 and 94. If you like that particular style of hip hop, yes, you could make that argument. But I think for those who try to be more musically open-minded, you'll find plenty of things to like beyond just these kind of narrow aesthetic eras that exist.
Yeah, it's not a hard and fast rule, but I would say for a lot of Jamaican dub music, for sweet soul, for, of course, funk, for psych rock. There was this great period of music that a lot of really seminal, important work, and you can find a lot of other things. My other random record collecting rule was that usually if there was an integrated band, it was almost always going to be pretty hot. Like if there was a white guy, if there was an integrated band, it was almost always going to be good. That was my other rule. I don't know, but of course these are just guidelines. All right, so you want to move on? I would like to move on and pose a kind of discussion question and really get your thoughts on it. And maybe we should post a link to it on YouTube or something like that. But it has been 15 years since the rapper Common came out with a single called I Used to Love Her, which is his history of hip-hop up to that point. And it ends with his lament that hip-hop had become exploitative and obsessed with gangsterism. Is it fair to say, because actually there's more time has passed since, it's almost we're at the midway point. That's the midway point. So if hip-hop starts in, say, 79, and we can debate about that, but let's say 79 because it's the Rapper's Delight, the first record, hip-hop record of 79, and 94, and then 94 to 2009, it's 15 years in both directions. Is hip-hop in arrested development? Is it still in the gangster phase that Common was lamenting?
Okay. I have a few thoughts. The first is, I wrote an essay for an anthology that Jeff Chang edited called. And why am I blanking on the name of this anthology right now? Go to Amazon.
Jeff Chang, of course, author of Can't Stop, Won't Stop, the in my opinion, the best history of hip-hop book.
Yeah, and this was the book that came after it. And when Jeff sees this, he's going to kill me for not remembering the name of the book. I'm literally just blanking.
Is it classic material?
No, it's that was my book, actually.
That was your book, right? Sorry.
Oh, man, this is killing me. I don't want to seem too conspicuous typing up Amazon right now, but we'll get the title later.
Okay.
I researched a history of hip-hop journalism for that, and so one of the things I did was to go through old issues of rap magazines from the late 90s the late 80s and early 90s. And it was really amazing, especially at the time that MC Hammer and Vanilla Ice were coming out. You would see all of these sort of, hand-wringing editorials about how hip-hop was dying and being taken over and losing its soul. And I mean, this is maybe barely 10, 12 years into its history, but the belief that hip-hop was dying or was about to be deaded, I mean, it's such a familiar cycle and belief and fear. It's sort of hard for me to take seriously. I'm not directing this towards you. I'm just saying this general idea that there's something dramatic that's shifted. I think those anxieties have always been part of any kind of upstart genre's concerns around its purity and its authenticity and all these other things. Now, that said, I think asking is hip hop in a state of arrested development. I think the main difference between now and when Common first recorded that song is that the media landscape has changed, has really, really narrowed. You go back to the early to mid 90s and you have a lot of record labels willing to take a lot of chances on different artists because hip-hop was new enough that they didn't really have a sense of what was going to hit, what wasn't going to hit. So why not just sort of put stuff out there and then see what folds? And see what sticks to the wall. And this is before you see the massive shrinking and consolidation of a lot of record labels. Where now you have it's probably like 2 record labels running everything around the world at this point. That there's more options, and I think both in terms of record labels, I think in terms of radio, that the number of outlets, the number of ways that one could get attention and develop develop an artist profile, it was just a much more open time. And what's happened is because of both economic reasons, because of industry reasons, because of media consolidation, all of these things have narrowed significantly, so that it's very, very hard to have the same kind of diversity of voices that might have existed. That's not to say that the diversity doesn't exist, in the real world. What it means is that it doesn't exist within the kind of media distribution that we would have had, 10, 15 years ago. If you look at the kind of playlist that exists for any Clear Channel radio station, it's the same playlist from city to city. It's a very narrow band of stuff that you can actually get access to.
Do kids still listen to the radio? I mean, don't a lot of kids get their hip-hop from the internet? I mean, Wall-E, isn't he an example of somebody who just put his stuff out on the internet and now he's a big star?
Who?
Wall-E.
I couldn't hear the artist.
Wall-E.
Wall-E. Well, I don't know, but I mean, if you look at Wall-E's record sales, I haven't really looked at it recently, but I'm not certain that he's actually doing that well without. I mean, radio play, for better or for worse, is still one. I won't say it's the only, but it's one of the means through which you're able to have sort of the kind of financial success that previous generations of rappers have enjoyed. I think what's changed is perhaps the expectation. It used to be that an independent artist, back in the late 90s could sell, 6 digits fairly easily. Nowadays, if you make it to 50,000 copies, that's considered to be really, really good. So I think that there's sort of the scale has shifted because the economy of records and of hip-hop records in particular, I think have changed quite dramatically. But I don't think it's the idea that hip-hop as a movement, as a collection or a community of artists has necessarily changed irrevocably. I do think that the access that people have to different artists is what's really, really shifted. And it makes it seem as if rap music is far more narrow and single-minded than I think it is in reality.
But wasn't the internet supposed to make us all have access to there's all these, that a rapper could put their stuff out there on MySpace or later in other mediums and, we could bypass the record labels. What is it? Industry rule number 4080, record company executives are shady, to quote the Tribe Called Quest. Wasn't the internet supposed to be this great leveler? And you're saying the era of the internet is narrower in some ways.
No. I don't think the internet is the narrower. I think the fact that you went from X number of major record labels 15 years ago to having that whittled down to, I think it's probably 3 or 4 at this point, who control most of the distribution, at least in the U.S. I mean, it's a very small number of gatekeepers that can help constrain and filter down who they want to support, and any other artist that's trying to fight for some room in there has that many fewer options. I think the consolidation again in radio has made a huge difference in this because you didn't have the same kind of monopoly control within a handful of radio owners that you would have had in those times. And so the kind of playlist that people have access to becomes so much more cookie cut because it's one programming director making the decision for literally hundreds of stations around the country. So the way in which the internet was supposed to be the great leveler was it was supposed to represent an end around convention.
Right.
And I think to a certain extent, sure, that's happened because now you can put your music out there sort of in the proverbial world. But if you are a MySpace rapper and you have 14 people who are listening to your song, yes, you have access to the public that perhaps didn't exist. You have global access to an international audience in a way that didn't exist, pre-internet. But 14 people is still 14 people. So, I think what's happened is you have many, many more artists vying for attention, but they're all competing with each other. And the number of artists who can still sort of rise to the top or pass a critical mass of listenership is still very much constrained, in I think a lot of ways, because if you're just depending on the internet only, it's very hard to break out that way.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying in terms of the career. I guess maybe I'm basing this only on me, but I don't listen to the radio anymore. I read your blog and other blogs. I get music I basically get my music through the internet. So, so I have gaps. In what's coming out, but at the same time, I feel like I'm much more in control of my own playlists. And I just assume that a lot of people are getting their music that way, but maybe I'm wrong.
I mean, I'm sure if you talk to any radio executive, they'll say that there's certainly been a shift in that.
Right.
But I think part of what's happened, and maybe this is something that you're talking about too, is that listener tastes have been atomized, and that there is much less consistency or kind of a consensus that gets built around certain artists because there's so many greater options. I mean, that's one argument that I've heard. I don't know to what extent that's actually true. I've also seen studies that suggest that if you look at, again, if we're just talking about hip-hop, if you look at the number of hip-hop blogs and how many of them duplicate the exact same content, then you sort of question whether or not it's actually really opening up all of these new voices or creating avenues for all of these new artists when it's still, when basically people are following each other. It's an echo chamber effect in essence.
Yeah. Oh, I see what you're saying. Like that there's a right. That's actually a smart point, which is that now this kind of brings. I want to actually stay a little bit on Common's criticism, and I would point out that there's an irony, which is that 1994, at least according to a lot of hip hop critics, is the greatest year ever for hip hop, or one of the great years for hip hop, because you have the beginning of Jay-Z, you still have Biggie and Tupac, and you've got Nas, Illmatic is 93, I guess, but you still have New York radio in the early 90s, and I remember very well, was like, it was just amazing. It was everybody on it was great. And and you pointed this out earlier, here's Common lamenting like, it's not as pure, it's not like we used to do it in the park and everything like that. And yet, in a weird way, maybe we could look at Common, not like he's the most important rapper, but like Common's doing Gap commercials now. He is, he did Poker Face. I mean, he's sort of become the thing that he criticized. Do you think that's true?
That he's become the thing he's criticized?
Yeah, that in some ways he's, he used to try to be this kind of, intelligent, authentic critic within hip hop, and now he's, I guess, do you think he's kind of as banal in some ways as the excesses that he was criticizing way back when?
I think one could certainly make that criticism. I wasn't a big fan of his last album, and the stuff that I've heard from him the last couple of years has not exactly, inspired my interest as much. But I feel that way about a lot of artists. And I mean, Common was in his early 20s when he made that song at most. It's been 15 years. Like, I'm not going to really, really hold him to something that he said in a very different part of his career. And I would say that for a lot of artists. If Common was still on that same tip, I would say, find something to talk about. Like, you want your artist to have some kind of, artistic evolution or change, or just find new things to do or say. So that doesn't really bother me. I mean, I think to the extent that I Used to Love Her was a manifesto, which you could say it was, but it was a manifesto of the time. And hip hop, 2009 is not 1994 in many, many different ways. And so the extent that I wouldn't expect him to have the same attitudes, to have necessarily the same criticisms, and whatever direction he's taken his career in, I think it's fair to evaluate it on its merits sort of right now. I don't necessarily feel the pressure to have to hold him to compare his career currently to what it was, again, back in the mid-90s.
Would you say that Resurrection, the album with I Used to Love Her on it, is in your opinion one of the classic great hip hop records?
In my opinion, yeah. I mean, I think so. I think it certainly is reflective of my aesthetics of hip hop, and especially at that time. It's an album that I still will put on occasionally, once or twice a year, just to kind of remind myself of what it was like listening to it, its merits and whatnot. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's funny because it seems like the entire album. I mean, I agree with you. I think it's one of my favorite hip hop records. It's like he's rapping with like a head cold. You know what I'm saying? It sounds like his delivery. It sounds like his nose is stuffed up the whole time. I mean, almost like, I don't know if you pick that up, but I mean, it's very. I think it's great stuff, and I love No ID, who I would love to find out what he's doing now, because he was one of my favorite producers at the time.
He's producing for Jay-Z now. That's what he's doing.
Is No ID producing? Is he on is he on the latest Jay-Z, the Blueprint 3?
I mean, I don't know how many tracks he did on it, but he definitely did The Death of Auto-Tune. So, yeah, No ID he's doing pretty well for himself, I got to say. Yeah.
All right, cool. So I want to move on to something kind of related to this, which is, is there a space, and you're a critic, and among other things, is there a space for the critic to sort of, how do you balance the fact that you can have really brilliant wordplay and compelling music that at the same time is valorizing very, I would say criminal and parasitic behavior in a lot of hip hop. So you've got a lot of rappers who have made their names and made, I think, really significant and substantial art, but done so in a way that maybe has had a deleterious effect on the community, in that it is praised, and shown and maybe even apologized for a very brutal drug industry that has that over the years has certainly ruined a lot of urban neighborhoods.
Well, I mean, let's start by acknowledging that hip-hop didn't create the drug trade. It didn't create drug abuse or distribution. It's not responsible for the drug wars. It might chronicle them. It might dramatize. It might, create narratives from it that can be profited from. But I mean, that's not that different than the book industry, than the movie industry. Certainly, it seems to me a little odd to single out. And again, I'm not directing this to you. I do think that your point here is a frequent criticism, but it seems odd to me to single out hip hop for doing it when, if you look at sort of the relationship between popular culture and drug culture, I mean, this is something that is deeply embedded in American history. So it's not something that I think hip hop does that's uniquely. I mean, nor is the glorification of crime and violence. I mean, one only needs to walk themselves into a movie theater or look at like what kids' toys are like, and you find those same kind of glorifications everywhere. So to me, it seems really interesting that that hip hop tends to get singled out for this, when to me hip hop is merely reflective of the same kind of cultural values around the glorification and acceptance and valorization of violence that we see throughout American society, not just in the contemporary sense, but throughout American history. And especially when it comes to sort of forms of music, rock, the blues. I mean, there's been a long tradition. I mean, going back to sort of minstrel days of again valorizing bad behavior and of making that into compelling art, or at least commercially viable art, because there's an audience for it. There's a desire to consume these things. So, I mean, do I think that artists of any stripe bear some kind of accountability and social responsibility? Yeah, but I don't necessarily put that ahead of the same kind of responsibility that many people who have a public platform owe, whether it be civic leaders, business leaders. I don't think we should put artists up on a pedestal and make them take the heat in ways if we're not necessarily applying the same kind of standards and the same kind of criticism to people throughout our society who profit, whether figuratively or literally or materially, off of things such as violence and crime, drugs and whatnot.
But we have countless raps about the struggles of your drug retailer and the various rules of the crack game. There's countless raps about the prostitution industry, and and they're all sort of enforce in some ways a message about the importance of being vigilant against your enemies and being unrelenting in some ways. Not everything, but I don't know, when is someone going to come up with a really good hip hop song about maybe planting a community garden and the importance of organic vegetables? I don't know, just some other concept, because it just seems, back to the common question, it just seems that hip-hop is focused in some ways, is so interconnected with the drug, with drug retail.
Right. When's the last time you heard a really good song about planting your own garden and eating organic vegetables in any musical genre? You think they're pop artists?
Touche.
Down and pitting those lyrics Is our jazz artists who are trying to think of how to interpret this into an instrumental? I mean, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me how it is that, again, hip hop somehow bears all of this responsibility in ways that we don't expect from other artists. I mean, would it be great if there was sort of more positivity out there in the music? Sure, but I mean, I'm always caught here because I think the danger on one hand is I think it's really problematic to somehow scapegoat hip hop or rap artists for, again, we expect them to bear this standard when really it really should fall on people who I think have much greater kind of institutional and organizational impact on people's lives than rap artists do. At the same time, I don't want to let people off the hook for saying dumb stuff, right, and saying things that are irresponsible. But it's a very thin line between, again, not wanting to put too much responsibility, but also obviating responsibility. But I think we have to come back to this basic point that hip-hop's values are deeply reflective of America's values. And there's not much that you can find in hip-hop that you don't find expressed, perhaps with other language and other vocabulary, but the essence is still there in many other parts of our society. So, you talk about the glorification of, gun violence in hip-hop. Rappers like to talk about the kind of guns they rock. I'm sure if you spent enough time on gun enthusiast forums, you would find the same kinds of things going on there, just with different language or different. I mean, it's all part of the same kind of, I think, cultural pool that people of all different communities draw from. We just have a tendency to really pinpoint on hip hop because hip hop's popular, so it's out there. I'm going to hazard a theory and say that I think part of it's racial too, because of the ways in which the African American community has historically been criminalized, and that it's easy for us to sort of turn there as to put that responsibility there. But again, the values that you hear expressed are expressed in many other different ways in many other different communities. We just don't spend as much time, I think, talking about it or wringing our hands. So I mean, I think it's worth having that conversation within the hip hop community. I think it's worth having that conversation in many different communities, though.
Yeah, right, fair enough. But hip hop, it seems to me, is overwhelmingly, and I say this as someone who likes it. And I started off by saying it can still be great art. It doesn't have to be either or. So you can separate the aesthetic understanding or criticism of something from the impact of it politically or socially. But it just seems that my sense is that hip hop is stuck in the retail crack game for 20 years. And I'm not saying that there's a lot of things it could do. And ultimately it depends on, what is that great Mos Def line? We are hip hop. So, if we, people need to, sort of take it upon themselves maybe to change it. And I also wonder sometimes who's buying it. Like, so many white kids buy gangster rap music in some ways because of, I guess, of voyeurism. And I think also because, when you're a middle manager or you're stuck in your job and you feel in some ways powerless, this is music that allows you to sort of feel briefly very powerful. Do you think there's something to that?
I mean, I think that those kind of like sociological analyses,
right.
I think that it may hold some weight. But this is something that Robin Kelly, I think, has really pushed the point, which is that hip hop, like most cultural forms, at its core, is about pleasure. It's the pleasure of consumption in terms of enjoying the music. It's the pleasure of performing. It's the pleasure of creating, and that what people get out of hip hop, any other musical form, is sort of just kind of that pleasure of creativity. The content, that certainly ties into it. And I think in terms of, if you're saying that hip hop offers sort of this escapist fantasy for many different people, yeah, sure. But then again, so do many other forms of culture as well. I mean, the gangster film is such a staple of American cinema through every generation. Because there's something about it, there's the kind of the rags and riches aspect to it that I think it's sort of the deviance of it as well that appeals to people, that they find something really alluring about that lifestyle.
Yeah.
Don't it? But they'll still go and spend $10, $11, $12 to go see it in theaters, or they'll spend $10 on iTunes to buy an album that does the same thing. But I want to go back just a second, Eli, because when you're talking about like what hip hop sounds like, I think again we have to come back to how are we listening to this? What access do we have? Who's responsible for producing the kinds of playlists that we listen to, right? I mean, if blogs, as I was suggesting before, if there's, a kind of this echo chamber effect of hip-hop blogs where the same artists are always being spoken about, to what extent are labels, helping to influence that by offering, exclusives or leaking material to one that they know will then get replicated to all these other ones. It's not as if you took a poll of what every rapper recording music out there sounds like. You would find that 90% of them are doing songs about crack. But if you were to look at who has access to the means of production, the means of distribution, that's a very different story. And then I think you have to ask the question: well, who's making those decisions, right? How is Lil Wayne, being given sort of an outlet in a way that some other artist isn't? And I'm not saying, I don't want to make this sound like a conspiracy theory. I like Wayne a lot. I think he makes compelling music, and that certainly has something to do with it.
I'm not a big Wayne fan, but okay.
But what I'm saying though is those decisions go beyond just what rappers choose to record. It also comes down to what record executives and video jockeys and radio jockeys decide that they want to put on their playlists and put out there for public consumption. So, again, it's not to remove all of the responsibility from the artist, but it is to suggest that how we understand hip-hop in 2009, as it's always been, but especially at this current moment, we really have to talk about the structure of media. I mean, I'm sounding very sociological, but I think there's a point here.
Yeah, almost neo-Marxist.
Yes.
Structures of media.
I did come out of Berkeley after all, but I mean.
I know.
But I mean, the ways in which a song goes through this entire system and structure to be able to reach a consumer's hand, these are not random acts, and it's not just dependent on an artist recording a song. And
there are no accidents.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I don't think that. I think we want to talk about how limited hip-hop is and how problematic hip-hop is. It goes far, far beyond than talking about the artists. I think you got to take it back to the record labels. You got to take it back to radio and video programmers and ask them, why is this, the only songs that you're putting out? And I'll already tell you what they're going to say. They're going to say, well, this is what consumers want. But if consumers only have access to these 4 artists, well, they may not have an awareness of what else is out there per se. So, I think it gets very tangled, and I think that it would be myopic to only focus on the artist as being sort of the main person responsible. I mean, in a lot of ways, they have some of the least power in this entire arrangement.
The irony, of course, is that in some ways hip-hop is selling rebellion, right? And yet, if this structure, is as kind of corporate as you say, I mean, it's like the ultimate hustle, right? Like, I'm making you think you're a rebel while you are consuming exactly what I want you to consume.
Sure. And but this is something that's been said about popular music, going back to like Thomas Adorno. I mean, that the idea that it's about giving people an illusion of choice, an illusion of
right.
But it's all operating within these very large, structures of capitalism.
If the record industrial complex did not exist, Billy Bragg would be a massive seller. No, I'm just kidding.
There it is. That's really the
I'm just kidding. Billy Bragg, I don't think would be a massive seller, though some of his music is passable.
Well, that organic vegetable hip-hop would be much bigger if not.
Yes, I think organic vegetable hip-hop would be huge. I want to ask you, with the remaining time that we have left, to talk about some of these artists that perhaps are being foisted upon the masses. But I came across this idea. Are you familiar with the blog, The Passion of the Weiss?
Yeah, that's my friend Jeff Weiss who runs that, yeah.
I like it a lot, actually. And he came up with, I think, this concept, which I thought was very funny. I think it's one of his review, is that this is one of the best albums in the over 30 rapper category. And so I like this idea because I'm over 30 and you're over 30. And a lot of our favorite rappers, I think, we would agree, we both like Ghostface and Jay-Z.
Yeah.
And Raekwon has come up with Only Built for Human Links 2, right? And Jadakiss is another. I mean, so what do you think of this crop, I guess in 2009, very relevant to say, the Veterans Division? Is it as good, is it better than Drake or the kind of, younger hip hop guys? I mean, what do you think about that?
What I would say is that, I mean, number one, I think it's great that these artists are still recording, because hip hop has always been such a youth-oriented music and culture that it's very hard, I think, to just maintain that same kind of viability as one ages. Though, because the audience is aging, I think we're really entering into these new times where it'll be interesting to see to what extent you can have hip hop made for and by people in their 40s, and if that's going to sustain, if that's going to be sustainable or lucrative. I'm super curious if there's going to be the oldies equivalent of an oldies hip hop station. That's
right.
Nothing like that quite exists yet. But who's to say that it won't? Because hip hop's been kind of a big genre, and there's a lot of people out there who've been listening to it. I mean, how does like Raekwon's new album or Jay's new album hold up to the younger set? To me, it really just comes back to, I think, differences in aesthetics, and that hip hop is a very diverse. There's myriad styles within it. There's not any one thing that I would say is right or wrong. So, whether I like Drake or not, and I could try to create an opinion around his album, which I don't think it's even out yet, but this is stuff I've heard. But I would still be sort of approaching that, to some extent from my kind of, my aesthetic biases as someone who really liked the golden era of hip hop.
Right.
I'm self-aware enough. I try to be self-aware enough to know that I might be entering in with that bias. And so, to me, this is how I think a lot of my pop criticism has evolved. These days, I'm a little bit less interested in talking about, at least in this grand meta sense, about what I like and why I like it. I mean, that's sort of what I do with my blog. But when I am writing criticism, I'm also trying to understand, why do other people like it, right? So what is it about Drake that people seem to group around? I haven't quite figured that out yet, by the way. But I mean, I don't want to say a million Drake fans can't be wrong, because frankly, yes, they can, and a million fans of anyone can be wrong, I suppose. But I'm not interested in making these aesthetic debates, about what's good, what's bad. I'm more interested in understanding, what's popular, but more specifically, why is it popular? What is it? What's going on with a particular artist or a genre that maintains interest? And the thing that I've said in other interviews is that so long as hip hop or any style of music is still as inspiring to today's 17-year-old as hip hop was for me when I was 17, I'm not going to knock it, because if it's still moving people in that way, clearly something's working there. And just because I don't get it doesn't mean that there's not something to be gotten from it.
Okay. All right. Well, that's good. But what do you think of the new Jay record? I'm surprised to say that I really liked it.
The Jay record got better with subsequent listens. I think the first time I gave it a listen through, I wasn't really feeling it that much. It seemed to me to be a little bit inconsistent. There were definitely some songs that just didn't work for me. His flow is really off in a few songs. I think a lot of those criticisms still hold, but at the same time, with each new pass through the album, I kind of liked it better and better. I think it's a very commercially smart and astute album in a way that I kind of respect, and on a basic level, I also enjoy. I mean, there's quite a few songs that I like. Do I think it's the best work that he's done? No. I think it's maybe the best album that he's recorded post-retirement, but that's not really saying much. But I think it's fascinating and interesting to see someone who was sort of this, skinny, awkward rapper back, in the early 90s when he was in his teens, has not simply survived those times, but is now, the biggest rap artist and one of the biggest pop artists in the world. And there's something about that which I think is extraordinary in terms of that transition and that ability to sort of stay involved over the years.
It's interesting because, Jay, when he starts on Reasonable Doubt, is giving you such a rugged snapshot of what it's like to be in the crack game. I would argue that some of his lyrics really hold up as very good, as great writing. Really, like I love that line, like having coke in the trunk and cops in the rear mirror. And now a lot of his stuff is what it's like to be a multi-millionaire. You know what I mean? And like being friends with Robert De Niro and living in Tribeca. And, but it's still compelling because it's almost, there's something about Jay-Z that he just can't be fake, And now being real for Jay-Z is to be like, a corporate titan.
I mean, I'll say this much. I mean, he raps about what he knows in that sense.
Right.
Well, in addition to sort of embellishing that as well. But, I do like the fact that he's not necessarily pretending that he's still slanging out of Marcy Projects. As much as that keeps coming up in his music, that he doesn't want you to forget that he used to slang out of Marcy Projects. He also sort of acknowledges that, he's a mega media star and that he's married to Beyonce and that these are sort of relevant facts that one should know, and that he can sort of rap from that perspective. So, he's not holding on to his own past.
Right. I mean, it's in the 90s, like the song "Imaginary Player," which maybe we should try to link to. Like there's a scene where he's talking about how prosperous he is, right? And you don't know the difference between whatever various kinds of BMWs, and but yet at the same time there's something kind of really small time about that. But now he's really like kind of I don't know. It's like he's rapping from on top of the world, and I suppose you could criticize him for it, but I don't know. I find it oddly compelling, and I think he's got the best producers with him. I think Empire State of Mind just is very compelling musically. So there's Jay-Z. Do you like the Raekwon record?
It was better than I thought it would be. I thought it was too long. I think it really could have shed probably 3, 4, 5 songs and just be a tighter package. I mean, the impossible thing is you can't follow up made Cuban links. I mean, it's trying to follow up with Illmatic, which I think Nas maybe has has tried and not successful.
Stillmatic.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That said, I thought Ray put together a pretty good Wu-Tang album, for 2009. I like the production on quite a bit of it. I do wish that again it was just edited down a bit, but I feel that way about many albums that. Okay, this has been my theory. I think as we've changed to sort of an iTunes playlist listening style rather than kind of the linear experience of going through a cassette or an LP, that as things have become much more song based, why not put 25 songs on an album,
right? Like
half of it, then just filter that out of your playlist, and then you don't have to listen to it. I sort of understand that. I just think there's sort of a cost that comes with that, which is you're making a more laborious effort.
Right.
You want to listen to the whole thing.
You would never have a situation where like Prince made that. I love Love Sexy. Do you know the record Love Sexy by Prince?
Yeah.
It's one track. It's 11 songs, but it's one track, and he deliberately did that because he's like, I want you to listen to the entire thing all the way through, and no one would ever do that today.
Sorry, I have to. Well, you can't see this right now, but I have to switch locations because I'm about to run out of batteries. So I'm just moving over back to my desk so I can plug back in. All right. Anyways, go ahead.
No, I was just talking about Love Sexy being one track and how you would never have that. But the idea was the artist was like, I want you to sit down and I want you to spend 45 minutes listening to the entire thing. And in that case, because, Prince was a genius and that was his peak, it's worth listening to the whole thing. And I think your point about the iTunes era where it's like everyone's making playlists, no one's ever going to do that again.
Yeah, I think artists still make linear albums in terms of, sequence. Yeah. They still care about things like sequencing and all these things. But I do think that it's a lot easier to get away with making a really long album because that from a listener point of view, they can rework that playlist however they want. And, there's not as much of a price to be paid for filler. Like you can exit the filler in ways that didn't exist when you had to get through an A side and then the tape flips and you go through the B side and you don't really want to be pressing fast forward all the time. The economy of something like an Illmatic Again, we're going to let's bring back the golden era again. But I mean, there's something about the economy of that album which is remarkable that you just don't see from most other artists. Yeah,
not a weak track on. So let me end it on this note. I want to ask you, give me a couple things new and a couple things old that you think our viewers wouldn't know about that you think would really enrich their lives. I know it's a very open-ended question, but putting you on the spot, I hope not. But a few things that are out right now that you think are not getting enough attention that are really worthwhile, and then maybe something that you would say in terms of like classics that for our viewers. Is that too open-ended, Oliver? I'm sorry.
I mean, it is a bit open-ended, but I think it's not a bad question. And luckily, I'm at my desk. Let me see if I can find this one album that I'm looking for in my stack, so I can physically.
While Oliver's looking at it, Eli Lake will say, Mayor Hawthorne.
I would start with this new upcoming compilation of Mulatu Ashtake.
Yes.
I can't get his name down. Ashtake's stuff. He's really best known for being one of the main progenitors of Ethiopian jazz. And he's had sort of these kind of best of anthologies that have come out in the past, but I think the timing for this new best of, that's an actual best of Mulatu, which the other ones weren't really named or framed the same way. It's a great album. It's a great primer to both, I think, just the kind of uniqueness of the Ethiopian jazz sound, but it also has a lot of there's quite a few Latin songs on there because Mulatu was really into Afro-Cuban music, and so he sort of blended that into it. So there's a really incredible diversity that's on there, and that's, I think, coming in just another week or two. So again, it's Mulatu. It's Astake, I believe, and that's coming out on Stret Records. I would definitely recommend this book I'm holding up, Let's Talk About Love, by Carl Wilson, which is ostensibly a book about Celine Dion's Let's Talk About Love album, but it's really just a book on the nature of taste in music, the nature of criticism, and I think it's blown both me and a lot of other music and art critics I know who've read it away, just in terms of thinking about what it is to argue over taste and what is taste really insinuating. And I think that it kind of changes the way that you think about art, music, and society in terms of why we make these kinds of divisions between good and bad, and what are the consequences of that. So I'm a big fan of that. I'm trying to think of what else is on the horizon. I mean, there's the new. I'm going to plug right here. I just finished a new album that I wrote liner notes for, which is Betty Davis's Lost album from 1976. Is It Love or Desire? Just came out.
For our viewers, Betty Davis, former wife of Miles Davis, and really a brilliant funk song singer, songstress, and just the best anti-love song I've ever heard. Anti-love song, the best Valentine's Day song.
Yeah, and so this is an album that she recorded in '76, but was never released because of problems with the label, and it is finally resurfaced after over 30 years. And I had a really, really fun time researching and writing the liner notes. And I think it's a great project. Obviously, I'm biased, but I would also, other stuff that I like. I like the new Breakastra album, From Dusk to Dawn. I like a couple songs off the new Mayer Hawthorne album. In terms of single songs that I've been listening to a lot, I've been listening a lot to, let me get the title here, Never Forget You, by the Noisettes out of the UK. Really, really enjoying that song a lot. There's, my weekly playlist shifts, quite all the time. I've been listening to a lot of Catalonian rumba, basically funky flamenco stuff from the 1970s. This group, Los Amaya, Losamaya, and their stuff has been.
What was the name of the Thai funk band that you recently featured? The Red Hot.
No, the Impossibles, right?
The Impossibles, fantastic.
A Thai funk band that toured the U.S. and Europe, and when they were out in Sweden, recorded this really incredible album called Hot Pepper for I think Philips out in Sweden. That is really a really killer album. It's really like on any given day, I'm sort of flipping through different things.
And you still DJ?
Yeah, I do. I do a weekly party in Echo Park in Los Angeles on Thursdays.
Cool. Thank you so much, ODub.
Oh, thank you, Eli. I appreciate it. This was fun.
Yeah, it's totally cool, and we're going to have a link to it, but I cannot recommend enough. Soul Sides will enrich your life.
And that's soul-sides.com.
Yeah, but we'll have a link. Okay. Thanks a lot, OW.